Hello, and welcome to your lecture on regime change. Let's begin today by thinking about what regime change means. Remember that a regime refers to the fundamental rules governing political processes in a state. Therefore, regime change is much more of a change than changing the government, or what most Americans would call a change of administration. For instance, regardless of what political pundits and partisans might say on the television, Bush to Obama was not a regime change, nor will be the change from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping in China. A regime change involves moving from one basic type of governance to another. The most basic and happy kind we can think of is democratic transition, that is, movement from an authoritarian regime to a democratic regime. Of course, regime change often takes place among non-democratic regimes as well. For example, moving from totalitarian to a modernizing authoritarian regime, or from a modernizing authoritarian regime to a military dictatorship, or from a military dictatorship to semi-authoritarian electoral democracy. Finally, regime change can, of course, take place from democracy to authoritarianism. So let's examine a few ways that regime change might look. Military coups are one of the most common forms of regime change. This is because the military has an obvious advantage within a state, as it has all the guns. It also has a leg up on organization. The military tends to be a highly organized institution which enjoys a strict hierarchy and many loyal supporters. Therefore, the military leadership will often be a key part of this electorate in both democratic and non-democratic regimes. Wherever the military is not under civilian control, it's part of this electorate. When the military becomes convinced that rulers are running the state into the ground, or that they are simply compromising the interests of the military as an institution, military leaders may seize control and set up their own government, a military dictatorship, or as they are often called, a junta. One of the most famous examples, which you may be familiar with, is in the case of Chile, in which a military coup led by Pinochet overthrew the democratically elected government of President Allende, setting up a military dictatorship that ruled Chile with an iron fist for 15 years. Indeed, Latin America throughout much of the post-war period saw many military coups, as did countries in Africa and even Europe, where as late as 1967, Greece experienced a military coup. Some contemporary examples you may be familiar with are Gaddafi's Libya, as he had led a coup to overthrow the Libyan monarchy before his own recent demise, as well as the modern governments of Thailand, Myanmar, which is also known as Burma, and Fiji. Military coups are often quite a sudden change in the political regime, but regime change can also take place quite gradually, in baby steps with no clear dividing line between two regimes. Often this incremental process happens alongside gradual changes to the country's economy, society, and culture. Likewise, developing more or less institutionalized political procedures and other forms of institutional adaptation can slowly lead from one regime to another. There are many examples of this, perhaps the most dramatic being the centuries-long evolution of liberal democracy in the United Kingdom, which dates way back to the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, and goes all the way up to the 20th century, where they made important reforms and expanded the suffrage. China's political developments may also be characterized as gradual regime change, though certainly not a case of democratic transition. Over the decades, the regime has stopped being the personalistic and nearly totalitarian regime of Mao that was driven by its communist ideology. Because of social and economic changes mirrored by gradual adaptations to political institutions, today the Chinese regime is probably best described as a highly bureaucratic, modernizing authoritarian state that is now communist in name only. War and international intervention can also be behind regime change. Think of what happened after World War II. The Allies destroyed the fascist regimes of the Axis powers. The US supported the establishment of democracy in the states that it controlled, namely West Germany and Japan, while also supporting democratization and recovery with the Marshall Plan in France and other European cases. The Soviet Union supported the establishment of communist regimes in the states that it controlled following the war. The Cold War international order involved a lot of foreign meddling in domestic affairs of various countries. In the wake of the Cold War, our contemporary era has also seen growing international influence on domestic politics, often including international influence on regime type. This can be provoked by humanitarian intervention, as was recently the case with NATO involvement in Libya, or by efforts at state building, as evinced by NATO efforts led by the United States to intervene in Iraq and Afghanistan to build democracies in these troubled states. Finally, we come to what you've all been waiting for: full-blown revolutions. A true revolution is actually a very rare phenomenon. It goes somewhat beyond political regime change, though it almost always involves regime change. It involves fundamental shifts in the structure of society as a whole, including but not limited to the society's politics. This is actually a pretty high bar, and it's therefore a rare event. Some contrarians even argue that the American Revolution doesn't quite meet that criteria, because the basic structure of society in the colonies remained the same. One of the most clear-cut examples of a revolution is the French Revolution, in which the old structure of French society, based on absolute rule by the king and the division of society into 3 estates, was completely overthrown. Another clear example is the Russian Revolution, which replaced the Tsar's monarchy with a communist state, again fundamentally restructuring society by eliminating the nobility and, in theory, elevating the workers. On the flip side of that, the end of communism in Europe as the Warsaw Pact dissolved and the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 also represents a revolution. This revolution is somewhat unique in that in many, though not all, of the states experiencing this revolution, it was followed by democracy. Obviously, the French and Russian revolutions were not followed by democracy, and indeed, revolution has historically tended to lead to authoritarian rule. What about the Arab revolts? Are they revolutions? It's not actually clear yet. To date, they have caused enormous upheaval, but the basic structure of these societies is largely the same as it was before these revolts began. For instance, as of June 2012, a lot has changed in Egypt, but the same military leadership, now known as the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, is still pretty much in charge. It remains to be seen whether these revolts will actually be fundamental revolutions, or whether, as is often the case, these revolts will lead to more minor shifts as opposed to fundamental revolutions among society. So now we know what regime change looks like. How can we explain where it happens? More specifically, when a regime is faced with some major crisis, like economic collapse or widespread revolt, which regimes hang on and which crumble? Naturally, there are numerous interconnected factors, both international and domestic, that can help explain this. One key way to think about this question is to return to the concept of the selectorate. Remember, this is the subset of society that has the power to determine who will lead the state. Therefore, ultimately the regime will fall if enough of the selectorate decides that it would rather dispense with the regime. So what determines whether the selectorate sides with the regime or some new force? There are lots of potential variables. If the selectorate has enjoyed payoffs as a result of the ruler co-opting them, they might side with the regime as long as the money is still there. This can be a rather fickle mechanism for ensuring support. Close personal or ideological ties are probably a much more certain reassurance for rulers, as friendships and convictions tend not to dry up quite as quickly as money in tough times. Indeed, groups of elites that share a history of fighting in a revolution together will often share a deep bond that increases the loyalty of key members of the selectorate. Some argue that this is the reason that the Iranian regime was able to hang on when faced with months of popular protests in 2009. Another factor that influences the loyalty of the selectorate is communal bonds, and by this we mean community-based ties such as ethnicity, language, religion, or region. This is important in that where the powerful people in a country share the communal identity with the ruler, they may hold on to that leader until the bitter end. We can see how this can play out by comparing the differences between Egypt and Syria. Egypt Hosni Mubarak clearly became inconvenient to the Egyptian military relatively soon, so they were not willing to shoot civilians to help keep him in power. Though they may have shared the same communal identity as Hosni Mubarak, they also shared this identity with most of the protesters. On the other hand, Syria's Bashar al-Assad is a member of the Alawite minority in Syria, and a predominant group of politically and economically powerful members of Syria are also members of this relatively small minority. These Alawite members of the selectorate are thus willing to support Assad to the end, fearing what could follow him. Another key variable is state capacity and political institutionalization. Interestingly, this can cut both ways. Obviously, a stronger state has greater internal and external sovereignty and can more easily deal with crises and hang on to power. Regimes that enjoy high legitimacy are going to be much less likely to come to a crisis point in the first place. Stronger states will be much more politically institutionalized, and this means it might actually be easier for the regime to rise to the demands of crises and protests, and to have a more gradual institutional development that may not amount to a new regime in the short run, though it may result in a new regime over the long run, as we saw in the case of China. Therefore, political institutionalization might keep a regime in place in the short run while allowing it to adapt into a new regime in the long run. Finally, long-term changes to a state's society, culture, and economy can create opportunities for regime change. You'll remember the modernization hypothesis, the idea that economic modernization sets forth a number of processes that increase the likelihood that a state will become democratic. The basic idea is that as society becomes more complex and a middle class develops and disseminates economic power, they become more powerful relative to the state. Of course, this theory has also been used and abused by leaders of modernizing authoritarian regimes, who have argued that they must lead the country as autocrats until the country is sufficiently modernized for democracy. A rather shoddy logic, but it has become a way of legitimizing themselves. Cultural change is related to modernization, and it may also influence the viability of regime change. A very famous work in political science back in the 1960s by Ullman and Verba argued that some societies had more pro-democratic attitudes and made democracy possible in these states. More recently, Engelhardt and Loisel have argued that sweeping changes such as globalization, the growing impact of information technology, and the same mechanisms of economic modernization are causing more and more people to have what they term self-expressive values, such as equality for women and the importance of individual liberties. They argue that these self-expressive values help explain where democracy can develop and thrive. Finally, one interesting question is the role that information technology has in facilitating political protests and regime transition. On the one hand, it helps people overcome problems of coordinating dissent and exposes citizens all over the world to diverse ideas. On the other hand, it can also be a tool for autocrats, who can use these technologies to monitor their concerns. International variables are also becoming increasingly important, and the influence of international affairs on domestic regimes can be both direct and indirect. The direct influence is the sort of thing we mentioned earlier, with foreign governments directly intervening to bring about certain political regimes. For instance, in the wake of World War II, the USSR established its style of communist authoritarianism on a number of other countries. The USA tried to establish democracies, but where that failed, the US would rather see its dictator in power than the Soviet-backed dictator. Today, NATO missions that helped topple Gaddafi and the missions to try and bring democracy to Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as the UN stewardship of Kosovo, are other obvious examples of direct international intervention in bringing about regime change. Finally, international influence can be extremely pervasive even when it is not as obvious as these overt missions to bring about regime change. There are broad international trends that can affect the dynamics of regime change domestically, such as the fact that increasingly democratic legitimacy is the best way for regimes to find any legitimacy at all. There is also the idea of contagion, meaning that just like a virus can spread between two people sitting next to one another on a bus, the spark of political change can spread from state to state. We saw this dramatically in both the fall of communism in 1989, as well as with the sudden spread of the Arab revolts beginning in January of 2011. That democratization has occurred in waves over the past couple of centuries, and that regions tend to have clusters of similar regime types is further evidence that there is indeed something contagious about political regimes and political change. Big international organizations have also played an important role. For instance, the countries that exited communism on the borders of the European Union, such as Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, sped towards full liberal democracy much faster than countries that did not have such close ties to Western democracies. Finally, foreigners contribute to groups within states that have significant consequences on the logic of domestic politics. For instance, the U.S. has contributed to both the Egyptian military and to pro-democracy groups within Egyptian civil society. To conclude, let's think of a couple caveats to studying regime change. First, the question of regime change and revolutions comprise some of the toughest material to study in comparative politics. Indeed, almost nobody saw either of the huge explosions of 1989 or 2011 coming. The problems of social science loom especially large here, as we are trying to predict quite specific events in huge societies. It's hard enough to predict exactly what one person will do, but here we're trying to explain and predict the actions of millions of people who are all interconnected, both at domestic and international levels. People who are adapting and plotting and scheming and reacting to one another and changing every moment. So really, it's no surprise that we're not great at making predictions about just where and when political regime change will occur. Finally, it's really important to weigh long and short-term causes. Let's take the example of the Arab revolts. So there were many long-term factors that contributed to this occurrence. There is the growing international legitimacy of democracy. There is the fact that these states have seen a lot of economic modernization over recent decades. And there is the spread of information technologies. Mobile phones, the internet, Twitter and Facebook specifically have received a lot of attention. And there's the fact that demographically, these populations are becoming increasingly young, which has put a lot of pressure on the autocrats. But in the short term, you can really identify causes like the economic troubles and the rise of unemployment, especially among the youth, that has put pressure on the regimes. And then there's this single event that seemed to spark international contagion and actually led to a lot of the revolts, which was the self-immolation of a merchant named Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia. Now, self-immolation means setting oneself on fire, and Mohammed Bouazizi, a 26-year-old fruit seller, resorted to this as a last and most dramatic way to protest against the regime when corrupt Tunisian officials took his fruit cart away from him for no reason. This action resonated with so many people, and that's what sparked the Arab revolts. But can we really say that this one enigmatic event is the true cause, or is it the other short-term causes and the long-term causes? It's really difficult to speak in terms of one cause. We see this problem of multiple factors. We see possibilities for reverse causation. So, on that note, I'd like to congratulate you. You've wrestled with some of the most difficult but most fascinating subject matter in comparative politics. As always, feel free to get in touch, and have a great day.